An old woman stood beneath the oak trees holding a cardboard sign that simply said, "For sale." Beside her, an old iron cage rattled softly in the breeze, with two tiny German Shepherd puppies pressed against the bars. A few steps away, her husband sat in silence, looking less like a man resting and more like a man carrying a secret too heavy to speak. Why would an elderly couple sell the last living piece of their home? Why did the old man refuse to meet his wife's eyes? And why did a Navy SEAL, a stranger passing through Cedar Glen, stop the moment one puppy touched the cage door? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late morning settled over Cedar Glen, North Carolina, with a pale autumn sun and a wind gentle enough to move the oak leaves without fully waking the street. The town looked peaceful in the way old towns often did from a distance. White porches, brick sidewalks, flower boxes gone brown at the edges, and windows that had watched generations leave with suitcases and return with gray hair. But peace, like a freshly painted fence, could hide rot underneath. And that morning, beneath the oldest oak on Willow Street, Ruth Collins stood holding a cardboard sign that said in uneven black marker, "For sale." Ruth was 75, small but not fragile, with narrow shoulders, silver hair pinned into a stubborn knot, and hands that still remembered how to thread a needle without looking. For 30 years, she had altered wedding dresses, hemmed choir robes, patched children's school uniforms, and never once admitted when her own coat needed mending. Her skin was pale and finely lined, the kind of face that had spent a lifetime smiling politely when life gave her splinters. But her mouth that morning was tight, not cruel, only determined. Ruth had the kind of pride that did not shout. It folded napkins, paid bills on time, and said, "We're fine," even when the cupboards echoed. At her feet sat an old iron cage, dark with age, its bars scratched and slightly bent from years of storage in a backyard shed. Inside were two German Shepherd puppies, both about 7 weeks old, black and tan and soft as winter mittens. One was smaller, with rounded ears that had not yet decided whether to stand tall or flop sideways. The puppy pressed close to the back of the cage, watching the world with solemn brown eyes. The other had a wider face, brighter eyes, and the reckless confidence of a creature too young to understand sorrow. That one kept pawing at the corner of the sign, as if the word "sale" offended him personally. Every few moments the cage gave a faint metallic rattle. A small sound in a town determined not to hear it. A few steps away, Walter Collins sat on a low stone wall beneath the oak. He was 79, tall once, though age had bent him slightly forward, as if some invisible hand had pressed on his back for years. His white hair was thin but carefully combed, and a gray mustache covered a mouth that seems to have forgotten how to ask for mercy. Walter had been a clock repairman before his hands began to tremble, a quiet man known for fixing delicate things, pocket watches, mantel clocks, music boxes that played off-key songs from another century. People used to say he could listen to a broken clock and know what gear had gone wrong. Lately, he could not hear what had gone wrong in his own house, until the ticking became thunder. He kept his eyes on the sidewalk, not on Ruth, not on the puppies, not on the folded envelope inside his coat pocket, where the truth sat heavier than any tool he had ever carried. 3 days earlier, another letter had come. The words were formal, clean, almost polite. Default notice, final review, possible foreclosure. Walter had read it twice and then hidden it behind the loose brick near the pantry, because shame made cowards of men who had once believed themselves brave. He had signed the roof papers after the hailstorm in April, believing the salesman from Blue Ridge Home Solutions when he said the insurance would cover nearly all of it. The salesman had worn a navy blazer, soft brown shoes, and a smile so smooth it could have slid under a locked door. Walter had signed because the roof leaked over Ruth's sewing room. He had signed because Ruth's best wool coat had smelled of mildew for 2 weeks.
He had signed because a man who could no longer steady a screwdriver still wanted to protect his wife from rain. Ruth did not know all of it. She knew enough to be frightened, not enough to understand why Walter had grown so silent. That somehow made it worse. A secret in a marriage was not always a locked room. Sometimes it was a chair left empty at breakfast. Sometimes it was a husband saying he was tired when he meant he was afraid. Sometimes it was a wife pretending not to notice, because naming fear might invite it to sit down. People passed. A woman with grocery bags slowed, read the sign, and moved on with her lips pressed together. A teenage boy on a skateboard looked at the puppies, then at Ruth, then away, as if kindness required more courage than he had brought with him. An elderly man in a brown cap paused long enough to ask, "How much?" Ruth told him the price. It was too low. So low it sounded less like a sale than surrender. The man frowned, muttered something about already having a cat, and continued down the block. Across the street, behind the wide front window of Mitchell's Second-Hand and Sundries, Nora Mitchell watched with one hand on the curtain. Nora was 68, round-faced, sharp-eyed, and dressed in a purple cardigan loud enough to win arguments on its own. Her reddish-gray curls were clipped back with a silver barrette, and a pair of reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. Nora had the town's quickest tongue, and, hidden beneath it, one of its most easily bruised hearts. She sold old lamps, chipped plates, church cookbooks, and furniture that smelled faintly of attics. She also collected stories, though she preferred to call it paying attention. Once, she and Ruth had been close enough to finish each other's sentences over coffee. Then came the church fundraiser, a missing donation envelope, one careless accusation, 2 wounded prides, and a year of silence stretched so thin it became a wall. Nora wanted to cross the street. She told herself she was only curious, that Ruth had always been dramatic, that maybe the puppies were simply too much work. Yet the sight of Walter sitting apart troubled her. Walter had always stood beside Ruth like a fence post beside a climbing rose, quiet, plain, necessary. Now he looked as if he had been set down and forgotten. Nora's fingers tightened around the curtain. "Oh, Ruth," she whispered to the glass, irritated by the ache in her own voice. "What have you gotten yourself into?" Ruth heard nothing of that. She stood straighter when another car slowed, and she lifted the sign a little higher. Her arms ached. Her heart ached worse. The puppies were not just puppies, though she would rather swallow a thimble than admit that aloud. They were the last living piece of a family story she had not been ready to close. Their line went back to the German shepherd her late son Michael had loved, a dog that once thundered through the Collins yard with a tennis ball and muddy paws. Michael had been gone for years, but grief had a strange habit of leaving small doors open. A bark in the distance, a scratch at the back step. 2 puppies breathing in an old cage. Walter shifted on the stone wall, and the envelope in his pocket crackled. Ruth turned her head slightly. "You all right?" she asked. "I'm fine," Walter said. There it was again, the sentence older than both of them, patched and repatched until it could barely hold meaning. Ruth looked at him, really looked, but he kept his face turned away. For a moment anger rose in her, not hot but tired. She wanted him to say what had happened. She wanted him to stop treating her like porcelain. She wanted to shake him and hold him at the same time, which was marriage in its most inconvenient form. Near noon, a dark pickup rolled slowly along Willow Street and stopped at the curb. The driver was Caleb Hayes, 42, a Navy SEAL on leave, broad-shouldered and controlled, with short dark brown hair graying at the temples, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that seemed trained to notice exits before faces. He wore an authentic Navy working uniform Type 3 in green-gray-brown camouflage, soft and unarmored. No tactical vest, no plate carrier, no helmet, no gloves. Just a man in uniform, trying not to look like he belongs to anyone's trouble. Caleb had come to Cedar Glen for quiet, though quiet had never liked him much.
Years earlier, he had lost a working dog overseas, and since then any young dog made something inside him step backward before his body could move forward. He saw the sign first, then Ruth's rigid shoulders, then Walter's bowed head. Last of all, the cage. Caleb told himself to keep driving. People sold puppies every day. Old couples had reasons. Not every sad thing was a mission. But as he eased forward, the smaller German Shepherd puppy lifted its nose and touched the cage door. The old metal gave a soft, trembling clack. It was hardly a sound at all. Still, Caleb stopped as if someone from the past had called his name. Caleb Hayes did not step out of his truck right away. For a few seconds he sat with one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting near the gear shift, watching the old iron cage beneath the oak tree, as if it were something more dangerous than two puppies and a cardboard sign. The late morning wind moved along Willow Street, lifting dry leaves in small, nervous circles, and Cedar Glen went on pretending it was only another autumn day. A mail truck turned the corner. Somewhere a porch chime rang once and fell silent. Caleb had heard gunfire that frightened him less than that small metallic clack from the cage door. He knew how memory worked. It did not always arrive as a picture. Sometimes it came as a sound, a smell, a paw against metal. And suddenly a man was no longer standing in North Carolina, but somewhere he had sworn never to visit again. He opened the truck door and climbed out slowly. Caleb was 42, broad to the shoulders, with the contained posture of a man who had spent most of his adult life making sure panic never reached his face. His short, dark brown hair showed gray at the temples, and his neatly trimmed beard framed a jaw that looked as if it had learned to stay clenched. He wore his Navy working uniform Type 3 in green-gray-brown camouflage, soft and unarmored. No vest, no helmet, no gloves, nothing theatrical about him. To a stranger, he might have looked stern. To someone who understood grief, he looked like a man keeping one room inside himself locked at all times. Ruth Collins watched him approach with the wariness of a woman who had been polite for too many years and had finally run out of spare politeness. She was still holding the for sale sign, her small fingers bent around the cardboard edge, her silver hair pinned tightly enough to survive a hurricane or a church committee. Up close, Caleb could see the tiredness beneath her neatness. Her blue cardigan had been carefully brushed, but one button did not match the others. Her shoes were polished, though the soles were thin. Pride, Caleb thought, had its own uniform. He stopped a few feet from the cage and lowered himself to one knee, not too close. The puppies shifted inside. The shy one tucked back against the rear bars, dark eyes wide and uncertain, while the bolder one pressed forward, nose wet, ears half lifted like little flags that had not yet learned which country they belonged to. Caleb did not touch either of them. His hands stayed loose on his knees. He had learned long ago that touching a dog could become a promise before a man was ready to make one. "How old?" he asked. 7 weeks, Ruth said. Her voice was clipped, dry, almost businesslike. "German shepherds, healthy, eating well. No papers, if that is what you're asking." "We're not breeders." "I wasn't asking that." "Most people do." Walter Collins sat on the stone wall behind her, angled away from the street. In the sunlight, he looked even older than he had from the truck, tall but folded inward, white hair combed with care, gray mustache trembling slightly above a mouth that had forgotten what to do with itself. His hands rested on his knees, long-fingered and thin, the hands of a man who had once repaired clocks, wound springs, and coaxed life back into tiny, stubborn gears. Now those hands barely moved. His gaze remained fixed on the cardboard sign in Ruth's hand, as if each black letter were a witness called against him. Caleb looked from Walter to Ruth. "Why sell them?" Ruth's chin lifted. "Because we are too old for puppies." The bolder puppy chose that moment to chew the corner of the cardboard sign, tugging it just enough to make Ruth pull it back. "Hush, you little rascal," she muttered, but there was a softness in the scold that did not match her answer. Caleb noticed. Ruth noticed him noticing, and her mouth tightened.
They need a better home, she said. A yard, younger knees, people who do not wake up sore before they even do anything foolish.
That sounds reasonable, Caleb said.
It is reasonable.
Then why does it sound like you hate saying it? Ruth's eyes flashed. They were pale gray, sharp as sewing needles, and for a second Caleb understood that this old woman had probably survived more storms than most people had bothered to name.
Young man, I do not know who taught you manners, but kneeling beside a stranger's dogs does not give you permission to inspect her soul.
I wasn't inspecting, Caleb said. Just listening.
That is worse. People who listen always think they have found something.
From across the street, the bell over the door of Mitchell's Second-Hand and Sundries gave a small, desperate jingle. Nora Mitchell emerged carrying a folding chair she clearly did not need. Nora was 68, round-faced and bright-eyed, with reddish-gray curls pinned unevenly and a purple cardigan so vivid it seemed to have opinions. She had the brisk walk of a woman determined to disguise concern as irritation. Her shop apron was dusted with lint, and her glasses bounced against her chest on a chain as she crossed the street. "Ruth Collins," Nora called. "If you faint under my window, I'll never hear the end of it from the Methodist ladies." Ruth did not turn.
"Then close your window."
"I did, twice. Concern leaks through old glass." Nora stopped beside her and unfolded the chair with more noise than necessary. "Sit."
"I am not sitting."
"You look like a broomstick arguing with gravity." Caleb almost smiled. Ruth did not, though one corner of her mouth gave the tiniest betrayal before disappearing. Nora saw Caleb kneeling and gave him a quick once-over. Uniform, beard, tired eyes, careful hands.
"You buying?"
"No, ma'am."
"Good. You look like the type who'd ask sensible questions, and nobody here is in the mood for those."
She glanced at the cage, then at Ruth's face.
"Have you eaten?"
Ruth stiffened.
"That is not your business. So no."
Nora turned to Walter.
"Walter, did you take your pills this morning?"
Walter blinked as if pulled from deep water. "I believe so." Nora's brows rose.
"That means no, or maybe, or Ruth reminded you and you pretended to hear."
Ruth's expression changed. It was quick, but Caleb caught it. Fear, irritation, embarrassment, love, all crossing her face like birds startled from the same tree. She looked at Walter then, truly looked, and he looked away first. The shy puppy whimpered. Not loudly, just a thin sound, uncertain and almost apologetic. Caleb felt it in his chest before he could stop it. Another dog had once made a sound like that, years ago, after a blast had turned dust into daylight and daylight into screams. His name had been Ranger, a sable German shepherd with one torn ear and the irritating habit of stealing socks from sleeping men. Ranger had saved Caleb twice, annoyed him daily, and died with his head in Caleb's lap, while Caleb promised things no man had the power to keep. Since then, Caleb had treated dogs like open flames, beautiful from a distance, dangerous up close. The bolder puppy put one paw through the bars and swiped at the air, catching nothing. Caleb's fingers twitched. He curled them into his palm. Nora bent toward the cage, squinting.
"This old thing came from your shed, didn't it?"
Ruth's shoulders went still. Nora softened despite herself.
"I remember it. Michael's dog used to sleep in it when he was a pup. What was his name? Big fellow. Knocked over the lemonade table at the 4th of July picnic."
Walter's eyes closed briefly. Buddy. The name settled over them. Even the wind seemed to step around it. Ruth spoke quickly, as if speed could keep feeling away.
"It is only a cage, Nora." "No,"
Nora said, quieter now.
"It was never only a cage."
Caleb looked at Ruth again. He had come close enough now to understand that the puppies were not the beginning of the trouble. They were the last visible piece of it. The old man's silence, the woman's rigid back, the friend watching from across the street, the too low price, the cage from the shed, everything had the shape of a story no one wanted to tell.
The bold puppy grabbed the bottom edge of the for sale sign in his tiny teeth and tugged. The cardboard bent, then tore slightly, warping the black letters until the words looked crooked and wounded. Ruth pulled it back too late. For a moment, all of them stared at the damaged sign. Caleb rose slowly from one knee. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the puppies. He simply looked from the chewed sign to Ruth Collins, then to Walter, who still could not meet his wife's eyes. "Mrs. Collins," Caleb said, "are you selling these two dogs? Or are you trying to sell the last thing that makes you feel like you haven't lost yet?" Ruth Collins did not answer Caleb at first. The question hung beneath the oak tree like a bell that had been struck but refused to stop trembling. She held the torn for sale sign against her chest, the cardboard bent where the bold German Shepherd puppy had chewed it, and her gray eyes fixed on Caleb with a fury sharpened by humiliation. Cedar Glen's late morning had warmed slightly, but Ruth looked cold from the inside. "You young people," she said at last, her voice quiet enough to make Nora stop fussing with the folding chair. "Always think old age is something to diagnose. You see a gray head and a shaking hand, and suddenly everybody needs saving. Did it ever occur to you that some of us are simply tired of being studied like cracks in a wall?" Caleb did not move. He had been yelled at by officers, strangers, grieving fathers, and one woman in a diner who claimed he had taken her usual booth. Ruth's anger was different. It did not come at him like a weapon. It came out like steam from a sealed pot, built up over months of pretending the kitchen was not burning. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It occurred to me." "Then keep walking." The answer should have been simple. He could have nodded, returned to his truck, and left the old couple with their sign and their cage and their private storm. He had done harder things than walk away. The trouble was, walking away had begun to feel too familiar, like a coat he kept putting on, even in warm weather. He looked at Walter, whose face had gone the color of old paper. The elderly man's right thumb kept rubbing the side seam of his coat pocket, back and forth, as if something inside it burned. Nora Mitchell noticed it too. Nora's sharp eyes, trained by years of pricing cracked teapots and spotting fake silver, narrowed slightly. She softened her voice, which for Nora was like asking a church bell to whisper. "Walter," she said, "what's in your pocket?" Walter's hand froze. Ruth turned. "Walter?" He looked up then, and the shame in his face made Caleb glance away for a second. There were expressions a man should not stare at too long. Walter Collins was 79, but in that moment he looked like a boy who had broken a window and could not bear to hear his father come home. His white hair lifted in the breeze. His gray mustache trembled. "It was after the hail," he said. Ruth's brow drew tight. "What was?" "The roof." A car passed slowly, the driver pretending not to look. The puppies shifted in the cage. The shy one pressed against the bars nearest Walter, while the bold one gave a soft, impatient yip, as if even a 7-week-old creature understood that truth was taking too long. Walter swallowed. "Back in April, after the hailstorm. You remember the leak over your sewing room?" "Of course I remember." "I put 3 mixing bowls under it." "You put 4, Walter said automatically, and for one small, painful second they were simply husband and wife again, arguing over bowls in a kitchen that still belonged to them. Then the moment passed. "A man came by," Walter continued, "from Blue Ridge Home Solutions. Said they were helping half the county, said the insurance companies were slow, and if we waited until winter the water would get into the beams." His voice roughened. "He said they could start right away." Caleb listened without interrupting. He had learned that confession often arrived in pieces, and if pushed too hard, it scattered. "What man?" Ruth asked. "Name was Darrell Pike." Walter's mouth twisted around the name. "Tall fellow, maybe 50,
tan skin, silver hair combed back, salesman's teeth. Wore a navy blazer even though it was hot. Spoke to me like I was still the kind of man who knew what he was doing. Nora made a low sound in her throat. I've seen him. You have? Ruth asked. At the diner? At church parking lots? Outside the pharmacy after senior discount day? Nora's expression soured. That man smiled at widows like he was handing out sunshine. Walter nodded miserably. He told me the papers were standard. Said Blue Ridge would handle the insurance forms. Said the loan was temporary, just to get the work started. He talked fast, but not rude. That was the trick of it. He made me feel foolish for needing things repeated. Ruth's face changed. Anger was still there, but beneath it, something more frightened opened its eyes. Walter, what did you sign? He looked at the puppies instead of his wife. Too much. The words were small, but they seemed to empty the street. He told them, haltingly, how the first bill had arrived higher than expected, how he called the number and reached a cheerful woman who told him not to worry. Adjustments took time. How another notice came, then another, each one with fees folded into fees until the numbers no longer seemed real. How some letters went to their old postal box behind the church, the one they had stopped using after Ruth's hip surgery because the steps were too steep. How he found out too late that missing those notices meant missing the chance to dispute the charges. Ruth stood very still. She had known trouble was near. She had smelled it in Walter's silence, felt it in the way he checked the mailbox before she did, heard it in the hollow sound of him saying, "We'll manage." But knowing a storm was coming was not the same as seeing the roof tear open. "You hid this from me?" she said. Walter flinched. "I was trying to fix it first." "No. You were trying to keep me from knowing." "I was trying to keep you from worrying." Ruth gave a short laugh without humor. "And how did that work out for us?" Caleb looked down at the cage. The bold puppy had abandoned the sign and was now pawing at the latch, full of useless courage. The shy one watched Walter with soft, solemn eyes. Caleb thought of Ranger again, not at the end this time, but younger, nosing open a barracks door he had no business opening. Dogs had a way of finding closed things insulting. Nora crossed her arms tightly. "Blue Ridge?" she murmured. "Lord have mercy." Caleb looked at her. "You said you've seen the salesman around." "Not just seen him." Nora stared across the street toward her shop window, where old lamps and chipped vases stood in dusty rows like witnesses. "Evelyn Harper sold her piano in June. Said she was downsizing. But that woman loved that piano more than she loved most people. 72, thin as a reed. Always wore pearl earrings even to buy tomatoes. Her husband left her old hymns tucked in the bench." Nora's eyes narrowed further. "Then Margaret Bell sold her wedding china." Retired school teacher, tall, brown-skinned, silver braid down her back, could silence a room with one eyebrow. She said plates were just plates, but her hands shook when she wrapped them. Nora turned slowly toward Ruth. "And Tom Alvarez sold his old red pickup. 76, former mechanic, big shoulders, white beard, laughed like gravel in a bucket. Said he didn't drive much anymore. I believed him because believing people is easier than asking why their voices break." The sidewalk felt quieter after that. Private sorrows, Caleb thought, had been sitting all over Cedar Glen with price tags tied to them. Ruth lowered herself into Nora's folding chair at last. Not because Nora had won, but because her knees had surrendered. She stared at Walter, not crying. Ruth Collins did not give tears to the public. Her pain was more controlled than that, and somehow harder to watch. "How long?" she asked. Walter's answer came barely above the wind. "Since May." "May." She repeated the month as though it belonged to another language. "All summer you let me sew curtains for a house you thought we might lose." "I thought I could make it right." "You thought alone." Walter bowed his head. Nothing in him defended itself now.
Caleb stood beside the cage, feeling like an intruder at the altar of an old marriage. He had seen men confess fear before battle. This was worse. Battle made fear respectable. Marriage made it intimate. Walter had not hidden the papers because he did not love Ruth. He had hidden them because he did, and because age had taught him the cruel lesson that needing help could feel like failing the person you most wanted to protect. Caleb spoke carefully. "Mr. Collins, may I see the paperwork?" Walter did not move at first. Ruth kept looking at him, and the silence between them thickened until even Nora had no joke brave enough to cross it. Then Walter reached into his coat pocket. His fingers trembled as he pulled out a wrinkled envelope, yellowed at the edges and soft from being handled too many times in secret. He held it for a moment, as if the paper had roots in his hand. Then he extended it toward Caleb. It looked less like a file and more like a white flag. Afternoon leaned softly over Cedar Glen, the kind of autumn afternoon that made every porch rail glow gold and every secret look a little more tired. The wind had quieted, but Willow Street still seems to hold its breath after Walter Collins handed Caleb Hayes the wrinkled envelope. Caleb did not open the papers right away beneath the oak tree. He only held them with both hands, careful as if the envelope were not filled with contracts and warnings, but with a man's last attempts to remain useful. Ruth stood beside the old iron cage, her jaw set, her torn "For Sale" sign tucked under one arm. Walter sat on the stone wall with his shoulders bent forward, not from age alone, but from the weight of finally being seen. Nora Mitchell hovered nearby, pretending to straighten the folding chair, though anyone with half an eye could tell she was staying in case Ruth's pride needed someone to argue with. Caleb looked at the two German Shepherd puppies. The shy one had curled in the back corner of the cage, nose tucked against one paw, exhausted by human weather. The bold one sat at the door, chewing a bit of cardboard like a tiny attorney objecting to the entire proceeding. "They need water," Caleb said, "and food." Ruth's answer came fast. "They ate this morning." That was hours ago. "Puppies do not melt between meals." "No, ma'am. But people sometimes do." Ruth's eyes narrowed. That sounded dangerously close to concern. Caleb glanced toward Walter, whose face had gone hollow with the shame of confession. "I've been accused of worse." He drove to Bell's Market 2 blocks away before Ruth could stop him. The store was small and old-fashioned, with a bell above the door, sacks of onions near the entrance, and a corkboard crowded with church suppers, lost cats, and handwritten requests for help no one wanted to read too closely. Behind the counter stood Earl Tatum, a heavy-set man in his early 60s with brown skin, a trimmed salt and pepper beard, and suspenders stretched over a plaid shirt. Earl had the slow, careful voice of someone who had spent decades watching town trouble enter through the front door, disguised as errands. "You feedin' yourself or rescuing a picnic?" he asked as Caleb set bread, cheese, apples, canned soup, bottled water, puppy food, and a small bag of soft training treats on the counter. Caleb looked at the pile. "Both, maybe." Earl's expression changed just enough to show he understood more than he would say. "Collins' place?" Caleb did not answer. Earl rang up the items, then quietly added 2 paper bowls and a small packet of ham from the deli case. "On the house," Earl said. "Don't make a speech. I'm allergic to gratitude." Caleb paid, took the bags, and returned to the oak tree with the uneasy feeling that Cedar Glen knew more than it admitted, and helped less than it should. Ruth refused the food before Caleb had both feet on the sidewalk. "Absolutely not. I haven't said anything yet." "You brought bags. Bags say plenty." Nora folded her arms. "For heaven's sake, Ruth, let the man commit groceries. I have not become so poor that strangers buy my lunch." Ruth's voice was sharp, but Caleb saw the tremor in her fingers when she adjusted the cardigan button that did not match the others. Pride could stand tall on an empty stomach for only so long. Caleb took out the puppy food first and set it beside the cage. "Fine. Then consider this for the 2 furry children currently attempting to eat your sign." The bold puppy sneezed as if accepting the title. Nora snorted. Walter, to everyone's surprise, gave a faint cough that might have been a laugh if it had been healthier. Ruth's mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was the first crack in the stone. "They are not children," she said. "No, ma'am. Children are easier to housebreak." This time Nora laughed outright. Ruth looked offended for 3 full seconds before surrendering to the smallest breath of amusement. Caleb opened the paper bowls, poured water, and pushed one carefully through the cage door without touching the puppies. The shy one crept forward after the bold one began drinking, and the 2 little bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in a way that made Walter look down quickly. Some sights were too innocent for a guilty man. They ate beneath the oak because Ruth would not go inside yet, not while the town might think she had been chased home by pity. Nora split the bread with unnecessary force. Walter accepted a piece only after Ruth glared at him, which was a marriage language Caleb did not need translated. For a few minutes, no one spoke about contracts, foreclosure, or the roof. They listened to the puppies lap water from paper bowls, and somehow that small, ordinary sound made the day feel less like a sentence.
Then Caleb looked at the old iron cage. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "Nora said this belonged to your son's dog." Ruth's face tightened. "Nora says many things, sometimes 2 or 3 before breakfast." Nora opened her mouth, then closed it, perhaps recognizing that even she should not step on this particular grave. Ruth looked toward the cage, and when she spoke again, the sharpness had worn thin. "Michael brought Buddy home in a laundry basket. Said he found him near the mill, though I suspect he traded his best baseball glove for him and lied badly to spare my nerves. Michael was 16 then, all knees and elbows, brown hair always in his eyes, freckles across his nose, and a grin that could talk a preacher into skipping the sermon. He was not a perfect boy. He once put a frog in Nora's mailbox." Nora lifted one finger. "A very rude frog." Ruth ignored her, but her eyes softened. "Buddy slept in that cage his first winter. Cried like the world had ended whenever Michael left the room. After a while, Michael slept on the floor beside him because he said no creature should learn loneliness too early." Walter pressed his lips together. Caleb heard the sentence land inside him, too. No creature should learn loneliness too early. Men, however, seemed determined to teach it to themselves. Ruth's hand brushed the top bar of the cage. "After Michael died, Walter put it in the shed. I asked him to throw it out once. He said iron keeps better than hearts." Her voice nearly broke, but she gathered it back with the skill of a woman who had hemmed grief for years. "These 2 are from Buddy's line. A neighbor's shepherd had a litter. We said we would take them until homes were found. Then the letters came. Then Walter became quiet. Then I thought—" She stopped. The bold puppy looked up at her with a wet muzzle and foolish hope. "I thought if we lost the house, we had no right to keep living memories in it." That evening, after Caleb helped Walter carry the empty cage from beneath the oak into the Collins yard, he drove back to the small room he had rented above the old firehouse. The room smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old smoke, with one narrow bed, one lamp, and a window facing the water tower. From the bottom of his duffel, Caleb took a small metal box. Inside lay Ranger's collar, worn soft at the edges, the brass tag scratched nearly smooth. He sat on the bed and held it for a long time. Ruth was selling puppies before loss could take them. Caleb had avoided dogs before love could ask anything of him. Different cages, same lock. Outside, Cedar Glen settled into blue dusk. Night found Walter on the back porch, staring at the iron cage now resting near the steps. The puppies were inside the warm kitchen with Ruth, their bellies full, their paws twitching in sleep on an old towel. Caleb had gone. Nora had returned to her shop, and the house was quiet except for the old refrigerator humming like a tired hymn. Walter touched the cage door, then looked at Ruth standing behind the screen. "I thought hiding it was protecting you," he whispered. Ruth's face was shadowed, but her voice was clear. "No, Walter, You only locked me outside your fear. Morning returned to Cedar Glen with a gray, low sky and a dampness that made the old houses look as if they had been thinking all night. The rain had not quite fallen, but it waited in the air, gathering on porch rails, window screens, and the rusted hinges of the iron cage now resting beside the Collinses' back steps. Inside the kitchen, Ruth Collins stood at the sink, washing the same coffee cup for the third time. She had not slept much. Pride could hold a woman upright through daylight, but night had a way of sitting on the edge of the bed and asking questions no one wanted to answer. Walter sat at the kitchen table with the wrinkled envelope spread open before him, the papers flattened under a salt shaker, a sugar bowl, and one of Ruth's sewing scissors. The two German shepherd puppies slept on an old towel near the stove, their little bellies rising and falling with the innocent confidence of creatures who believed morning meant breakfast, not foreclosure. Caleb Hayes arrived just after 9, carrying no groceries this time, only a small notebook and the careful expression of a man who had decided not to charge into a burning building until he knew where the exits were. He wore the same soft navy working uniform type 3, green, gray, brown, and unarmored, his sleeves neat, his beard trimmed, his eyes steady but tired. Ruth opened the door before he knocked. "If you brought pity, leave it on the porch," she said. Caleb looked at the covered sky. "Might get rained on." "Good. I brought someone better." Behind him stood Laura Bennett, a volunteer legal aid worker Caleb had called the night before, after finding her number pinned to the courthouse bulletin board. Laura was 49, tall and narrow-shouldered, with warm brown skin, silver-threaded black hair pulled into a low braid, and rectangular glasses that made her eyes seem both kind and impossible to fool. She wore a navy raincoat over a plain cream blouse and carried a canvas satchel stuffed with folders, sticky notes, and the weary patience of someone who had spent years reading the traps hidden in small print. Her voice was calm, but not soft in a helpless way. It had edges, like a ruler laid across crooked paper. "Mrs. Collins?" Laura said, offering her hand. "I'm not here to take over. I'm here to read." Ruth hesitated before shaking it. "Reading is how this mess began." Laura nodded once. "Then we'll read slower." That was the first thing anyone said that morning. Ruth did not know how to fight. They gathered around the kitchen table. Walter sat on one side, his long fingers curled inward, the old tremor visible now that he had stopped trying to hide it. Ruth stood rather than sat, as if sitting would make the trouble official. Caleb leaned near the counter, not crowding them. He had been trained for rooms full of danger, but this little kitchen troubled him more than some dark alleys had. The danger here wore lace curtains and smelled of coffee gone cold. Laura removed the papers from the envelope one by one. She did not gasp, she did not shake her head dramatically. She only made notes, circled dates, and asked Walter to repeat certain details. "This initial estimate," she said, tapping the first page, "was signed April 17th. The financing disclosure appears to be dated April 19th. Walter blinked. "Is that bad?" "It means the timeline is muddy." Ruth gave a bitter little laugh. "Mud is better than what I was calling it." Laura turned another page. "There are service fees here, inspection fees, processing fees, late fees attached to late fees. Some may be legal, some may not be properly disclosed. And this address," she paused. "This notice was mailed to a P.O. box." Walter's face tightened. "Old one. Behind First Methodist. Did you still receive mail there?" "Not since last winter." Ruth stared at him. "You never told me that part." Walter looked down. "I thought I could fix the address before it mattered." "You thought," Ruth said, and the words landed harder than a plate dropped on tile. For a while, Laura kept reading. Outside, Nora Mitchell crossed the street under a tilted umbrella decorated with yellow ducks, though there was still no rain. Nora was dressed in her purple cardigan again, this time with a flowered scarf tied too brightly around her neck, and she carried a metal tin of biscuits as if biscuits were legal strategy. She did not enter the kitchen immediately. She hovered at the back door until Ruth snapped,
Come in or haunt someone else." Nora entered. "Fine, but I refuse to be a quiet ghost." She set down the tin, took one look at Ruth's face, and grew less cheerful.
"What did they find?" Laura explained in careful language that the company might have used confusing financing terms, that the notices might have been mishandled, and that missing those notices may have cost Ruth and Walter the chance to challenge the charges earlier. Ruth listened with her arms folded, her knuckles white. "So what you're saying," she said, "is that Walter made a mistake, and then they built a house on top of it?" Laura looked at her gently. "I'm saying older homeowners are often pressured into signing documents they don't fully understand. I'm saying mistakes should not become traps." Walter closed his eyes. That should have comforted Ruth. Instead, it broke something loose. "You let me walk around this house like a fool," she said to Walter. "I sewed curtains for the front room. I priced paint for the porch swing. I told Nora I did not need help because my husband and I had everything in hand." Nora opened her mouth, then wisely shut it. Walter's voice, when it came, was rough. "You always have everything in hand, Ruth, even when you don't, especially when you don't. I thought if I told you I couldn't follow the papers, you'd look at me like I had already left you." Ruth's face changed, wounded now instead of angry. "I have been standing beside you for 53 years. "Beside me, yes," Walter said. "But sometimes you stand so straight there isn't room for anyone else to lean." The room went very still. Caleb looked toward the puppies because it felt wrong to watch an old love bleed in public. One puppy rolled onto his back in sleep, paws twitching, chasing some tiny dream. The sight was almost funny and almost unbearable. Ruth turned away from Walter, one hand pressed to the counter. "You made me a stranger in my own house," she whispered. Walter answered, "And you made being weak feel like a locked door." Neither was fully fair. Both were partly true. By noon, Nora had returned to her shop with a plan born from equal parts nosiness and grace. She taped a handwritten notice inside Mitchell's second-hand and sundries window. "If you signed a home repair contract after the hailstorm, come in for coffee. Bring your papers if you have them." The first person to enter was Evelyn Harper, the 72-year-old widow with pearl earrings and a thin blue coat buttoned to her throat. She moved carefully, as if afraid the floor might remember the piano she had sold. Then came Margaret Bell, the retired teacher with a long silver braid, carrying her wedding china receipt in a folder labeled Recipes. After her came Tom Alvarez, broad-shouldered and white-bearded, holding truck papers in one hand and his pride in the other. By mid-afternoon, 2 more elderly residents had arrived. Henry Wilkes, an 81-year-old former postman with a stooped back and watery blue eyes, and Lila Monroe, a 70-year-old retired nurse with cropped gray hair, brown freckles, and a voice that still knew how to tell people to sit down before they fell down. Nora poured coffee until the shop smelled like a church basement after a funeral, and for once, no one pretended everything was fine. Caleb and Laura came over with Ruth and Walter just as the first drops of rain tapped the awning. The old iron cage had been brought along because Ruth insisted the puppies needed watching, though everyone knew she was the one who needed them close. While Laura spread the different contracts across Nora's counter, the bold German Shepherd puppy discovered that the cage latch had not been fully secured. With the timing of a small, furry criminal, he shoved the door open, tumbled out, and charged beneath a display table.
"Oh no!"
Ruth cried. But the puppy was already skidding across the wooden floor, straight into an old tin box filled with buttons. The box tipped. Hundreds of buttons spilled everywhere, white, black, pearl, brass, red, blue, rolling under chairs and bouncing against shoes like tiny pieces of weather. For one stunned second, no one moved. Then Tom Alvarez laughed. Nora laughed next. Even Walter covered his mouth, shoulders shaking. Ruth tried to scold the puppy and failed halfway through. Caleb crouched to catch the escape artist, and the puppy licked his thumb before Caleb remembered not to let his heart answer. Laura knelt to help gather the buttons, smiling despite herself. Then her smile faded. She had one contract in her left hand, another beside her knee, and a third half covered by buttons. Her eyes moved from address line to address line. "Wait," she said. The laughter thinned. Laura picked up Margaret's notice, then Evelyn's, then Walter's. "These were all mailed to outdated addresses," she said slowly. "Or mailed after the response window had almost closed." A red button rolled to a stop against Caleb's boot. No one laughed now. Nora looked around her crowded little shop, at the papers, the buttons, the old people who had come carrying shame in folders and envelopes. "Well," she said quietly, "looks like my door opened just in time." The rain finally came to Cedar Glen in the early afternoon, not as a storm, but as a thin, gray curtain that softened the windows of Mitchell's second-hand and sundries and turned the sidewalk outside into a blurred ribbon of reflected light. Inside Nora Mitchell's shop, the smell of coffee, old wood, wet coats, and aging paper filled the air. Buttons still hid under chairs and display tables from the Puppies' little rebellion, and every so often someone found one and placed it in Nora's tin with a solemnity that would have amused them on any other day. But the laughter had faded. Laura Bennett stood behind the counter with 6 contracts laid out in careful rows, her rectangular glasses low on her nose, her long fingers moving from date to date, address to address, fee to fee. The more she read, the less she spoke. That, Caleb Hayes noticed, frightened the room more than any gasp could have. Laura was not a woman given to drama. She was built of patience, ink, and the stubborn belief that small print should not be allowed to hide cruelty. When she finally looked up, even Nora stopped pouring coffee. "Blue Ridge Home Solutions did not need to kick down anyone's door," Laura said quietly. "They built the cage out of paperwork." Ruth Collins sat near the old iron cage, one hand resting on the top bar while the 2 German Shepherd puppies slept inside with the door tied shut by a piece of red ribbon Nora had found in a sewing basket. Ruth's face remained composed, but her eyes had the hollow shine of a woman who had spent the morning learning that her private humiliation had a whole town of cousins. Walter sat beside her, shoulders rounded, his white hair damp at the edges from the short walk across the street. He had not said much since Laura began comparing the documents. Shame had made him quiet again, but now the silence was different. Before, it had hidden something. Now, it seemed to be listening for the shape of the truth. Laura tapped Walter's contract first, then Evelyn Harper's, then Margaret Bell's. "The language changes slightly in each agreement, but the pattern is similar. Initial estimate, emergency repair authorization, financing disclosure buried after the signature page, administrative fees added later, notices mailed to outdated addresses, incomplete addresses, or mailed so late that the response window was almost useless. That does not look like one confused customer. It looks like a process." Tom Alvarez, the broad-shouldered former mechanic with a white beard and hands scarred by decades of engines, muttered something sharp under his breath. Caleb's jaw tightened. He felt heat climb the back of his neck. The old heat that wanted motion, confrontation, a door opened too hard. "Where's their office?" Caleb asked. Laura looked at him over the top of her glasses. "No." "I didn't say anything." "Your face did." Nora pointed her coffee spoon at him. "For what it's worth, your face is very loud." Caleb exhaled through his nose. The bold puppy woke, yawned, and sneezed at him as if voting with Laura. Laura gathered one stack of papers. "This is not a problem solved by frightening someone in a lobby. If Blue Ridge did this across multiple households, the answer is records, statements, timelines, and a hearing. The people in this room need to be believed on paper, not just comforted in person." Caleb hated how true that sounded. He had spent much of his life trusting what could be done with hands, boots, breath, and nerve. But here the battlefield was made of margins. The enemy did not roar, it stapled. It mailed late. It charged fees no one could explain in a sentence.
He looked at Walter, and something in him settled reluctantly. Not every rescue began with running toward danger. Some began with sitting down and reading until your eyes burned.
Laura turned to Walter.
Mr. Collins, I need a written statement from you. Not polished, not pretty, honest. When the salesman came, what he said, what you understood, what you signed, and when you realized the notices were going to the old P.O. box. Walter's hands closed around the edge of his chair. Do I have to say I didn't understand it? Ruth turned toward him. The question had not been aimed at her, but it struck her anyway. Laura's voice softened without losing firmness. You need to say what happened. Walter looked down at his long, trembling fingers. There was a time I could take apart a clock with tweezers and put it back together before supper. Men brought me pocket watches their grandfathers carried across oceans. I knew every gear by sound. His mouth bent in a thin, bitter smile. Then Darrell Pike sat at my kitchen table and talked for 20 minutes, and I nodded like a fool because I was too proud to ask him to slow down. Ruth's lips parted, but no words came. Walter continued, quieter now. I hid it from you because I saw myself getting smaller. I thought if you saw it too, if you saw me confused, afraid, useless. His voice caught. I thought you would look at me like one more thing you had to carry. Ruth looked as though someone had opened a window in winter. That was when Caleb left the shop. He told Laura he would be back, but the truth was he needed air before his anger embarrassed everyone. He drove through the rain to Cedar Glen Animal Rescue, a low brick building at the edge of town where a painted wooden sign showed a dog and cat sitting beneath a crooked rainbow. The manager, Denise Ward, met him in the front office. Denise was 55, sturdy and broad-hipped, with cropped blonde gray hair, sun-browned skin, and forearms strong from lifting bags of feed and frightened animals. Her voice was practical, but her eyes had the permanent softness of someone who had learned that abandoned creatures were rarely the ones who had failed. You're asking about temporary placement? She said after Caleb explained. 2 German Shepherd pups, 7 weeks. If the Collins house gets sealed or if things get worse. Denise nodded. We can take them. Not ideal. Kennels are full, but we make room for emergencies. She led him down a clean corridor lined with chain-link runs. Dogs barked, whined, spun, slept, watched. At the end, an old beagle with a white face and cloudy brown eyes lay on a blanket, thumping her tail once without standing. That's Mabel, Denise said. 14, grumpy as a judge, still believes every visitor has chicken. Caleb stopped longer than he meant to. The sound of paws on concrete, the metal gates, the smell of disinfectant and damp fur. His hand went to his pocket before he decided to move it. Ranger's collar was there, folded like a secret. He gripped it through the fabric. He had thought Ruth was the one trying to give away love before loss could take it. Standing before those kennels, he realized he had been doing the same thing for years. His cage had no bars. That made it harder to admit. When Caleb returned to Nora's shop, the room had quieted into work. Laura had given Walter a yellow legal pad. Evelyn, Margaret, Tom, Henry, and Lila were writing their own timelines at separate tables, each person bent over the page like a student taking an exam in dignity. Nora moved among them with coffee and biscuits, making too much noise on purpose so no one had to hear themselves tremble. Ruth sat beside Walter, but not too close. The puppies were awake now, noses pressed together through the cage bars, watching Walter's pen scratch slowly across the paper. Walter wrote for nearly 40 minutes. Sometimes he stopped and rubbed his forehead. Sometimes he asked Laura how to spell a word he already knew. Ruth did not correct him. Caleb stood near the door, rainwater drying on his shoulders, and watched an old man do something braver than kicking open any office. Walter wrote down the sentence he had spent months avoiding. I signed even though I was confused, because I was afraid my wife would know I was no longer the man I used to be. When he finished, Laura slid the final page toward him. Sign here, if this is true. Walter took the pen. His hand shook badly enough that the first line of his signature wavered, but he did not stop. He signed his name all the way to the end.
Ruth did not forgive him in a grand gesture. She did not reach across the table and make the room sigh with relief. Instead, she placed her hand on the table near his, not touching, not yet. Close enough for Walter to see it. Close enough to say she had not left. By the next afternoon, the rain had washed Cedar Glen clean enough to make the town look innocent, which annoyed Nora Mitchell more than she cared to admit. Sunlight spread thinly over the wet sidewalks, caught in puddles, and shone along the windows of the Cedar Glen Community Hall, a squat brick building between the library and the old fire station. The hall had hosted pancake breakfasts, quilting circles, voting days, and one disastrous talent show involving a trombone and a goat. That day, it held something quieter and heavier. A room full of older people who had spent months believing their trouble was too private, too embarrassing, or too small to matter. Folding chairs lined the floor in stiff rows. At the front sat a long table where Laura Bennett arranged statements, contracts, envelopes, and a list of names Nora had copied in her slanted handwriting. Laura looked calm, but her dark eyes moved quickly behind her rectangular glasses. Her navy raincoat was folded over the back of her chair, and her silver-threaded braid rested over one shoulder like a rope she had used to pull herself through many difficult rooms. Caleb Hayes stood near the rear wall, broad-shouldered and silent in his soft navy working uniform Type 3. No armor, no gloves, no hard expression meant to frighten anyone. He had learned, not easily, that his job in this room was not to become thunder. It was to keep standing while other people found their voices. Ruth Collins sat in the second row with the old iron cage at her feet. The two German Shepherd puppies were inside, sleepy from lunch, and far less interested in justice than in chewing the corner of the towel Nora had placed beneath them. Ruth had argued against bringing them, then brought them anyway. She wore a dark green dress with a repaired cuff, her silver hair pinned with severe neatness, her face composed in the terrifying way only elderly churchwomen and retired school principals could manage. Beside her, Walter Collins held his signed statement in both hands. He had trimmed his white mustache that morning, and Ruth had brushed lint from his jacket without a word. That small act had nearly undone him. Across the aisle sat Nora, round-faced and restless in her purple cardigan, holding a yellow folder so full of names and notes that papers stuck out like feathers from an overfed hen. "If this folder explodes," she whispered to Caleb when he passed, "tell them I died organizing." Caleb almost smiled. "I'll make it sound noble." "It is noble. Nosiness has saved civilizations." The representatives from Blue Ridge Home Solutions arrived exactly 4 minutes late, which seems designed to suggest importance rather than apology. The first was Victor Lang, the company's regional operations manager, a lean man in his early 50s with smooth, blonde gray hair, pale skin, a narrow nose, and a navy tie pulled so straight it looked freshly measured. His face carried the polished patience of someone who had learned to say unpleasant things without wrinkling his suit. Beside him walked Marcia Klein, his attorney, a sharp-featured woman in her mid-40s with dark auburn hair cut at her jaw, a charcoal blazer, and eyes as cool and unreadable as river stones. She smiled at no one, not rudely, but as if smiling were a clause she had not agreed to. They sat at the opposite table with a leather folder, 2 pens, and the clean confidence of people who had never had to sell a memory to pay a fee. The meeting was overseen by Councilman Peter Doyle, a retired librarian in his 70s with a thin frame, brown skin, silver eyebrows, and a bow tie patterned with tiny books. Peter had a gentle voice, but people in Cedar Glen knew he could silence an argument by clearing his throat. He began by reminding everyone that the purpose of the hearing was to review concerns about home repair contracts signed after the April hailstorm, especially cases involving elderly homeowners, disputed notices, and possible foreclosure pressure. Victor Lang folded his hands. "Blue Ridge Home Solutions has always acted in good faith," he said smoothly. "We are deeply sympathetic to confusion that can arise during stressful repairs." The word confusion moved through the room like a cold draft. Ruth's fingers tightened on her purse. Walter looked down. Caleb felt his anger stir, but Laura did not even blink. She simply wrote the word confusion on her pad and underlined it once. Laura spoke first, not with fire, but with detail. She describes dates that did not align, financing pages placed after signature forms, notices mailed to outdated addresses, and response deadlines so narrow they might as well have been keyholes. She did not call anyone evil. She did not need to. Paper, when arranged honestly, could become a row of witnesses. Marcia Klein objected twice, politely. Victor Lang said the company relied on customer-provided information. Laura slid forward copies of 3 forms where the updated addresses appeared on earlier pages but disappeared from later notices. Then perhaps, Laura said, the company should explain why correct addresses entered the process and incorrect addresses left it. The room made no sound, but silence has many temperatures, and this one warmed. Nora rose next with her folder. She had prepared remarks which lasted approximately 14 seconds before she abandoned them. "I run a second-hand shop," she said.
"I know what people sell when they are cleaning closets, and I know what people sell when they are scared. Since June, I have bought a piano that still had hymn books in the bench, wedding china wrapped like a body, a red pickup that should have stayed in a family, and a box of Christmas ornaments from a woman who apologized to each one before letting it go." Her voice wobbled, so she made it sharper. "I thought I was minding my business. Turns out I was watching a pattern and calling it coincidence." One by one, the others stood. Evelyn Harper, thin and pale in her blue coat with pearl earrings trembling at her ears, said she sold her wedding ring after the 3rd fee notice because she was ashamed to tell her daughter in Ohio. Margaret Bell, tall and brown-skinned, her long silver braid resting down her back, spoke like the teacher she had been. Clear, precise, devastating. She explained how her notice had arrived 2 days before the response deadline. Tom Alvarez stood with both hands on his cane and admitted he sold his father's red pickup, the truck he had sworn to pass to his grandson. Henry Wilkes, the former postman, said in a watery voice that he knew mail routes, knew mistakes happened, but not this many in one small town. Lila Monroe, the retired nurse, said shame had kept her quieter than any illness ever had. No one shouted. No one pointed fingers like lightning. The truth gathered in the room the way rain gathers in a barrel, drop by drop, until its weight could no longer be ignored. Then Ruth stood. Walter looked up quickly, as if he wanted to stop her, and knew he had no right. She did not take Laura's prepared notes. She rested one hand on the back of the chair in front of her, and looked at Victor Lang, then at the room. "I am not here to tell you I am pitiful," she said. "I have been poor before. I have been tired before. I have buried a son and still remembered to pay the electric bill. What I am here to say is that old people are trained to be embarrassed by needing help. We are embarrassed when we do not understand a paper, embarrassed when our hands shake, embarrassed when our children worry, embarrassed when neighbors see the roof leak. So we say we are fine, and people believe us because it is convenient." Her gaze dropped to the cage at her feet. The bold puppy had fallen asleep with his paw through the open bars. "Yesterday I tried to sell these puppies. Not because I did not love them. Because I thought if the house was going to be taken, I should let go first. I thought surrender would hurt less if I chose it." Her voice trembled once, then steadied. "It does not. It only makes silence look respectable." Even Marcia Klein looked down at her pen. Councilman Doyle called for a brief recess, then returned with a decision that was not grand enough for movies but large enough for the room. The pending action against Ruth and Walter's home would be paused while the contracts and notice procedures were reviewed. Blue Ridge Home Solutions would be required to produce mailing records and re-examine similar cases involving senior homeowners after the hailstorm. It was not victory wrapped in a ribbon. It was a door held open before it could close. Ruth did not cheer. Walter did not weep. Caleb remained by the wall, feeling the strange humility of watching courage happen without noise. Ruth sat down slowly and released a breath she seemed to have been holding since spring. At her feet, inside the old iron cage with its door left open, the two German Shepherd puppies slept pressed together, unaware that a room full of people had just learned how heavy a small voice could become when it was finally joined by others. 3 weeks later, Cedar Glen wore late autumn like an old quilt pulled carefully over tired shoulders. The maple leaves had thinned, the oak trees stood half bare along Willow Street, and the Collins house looked neither saved nor lost, but suspended in that strange middle place where hope and paperwork sit at the same table and refuse to look at each other. The foreclosure action had been paused, not erased. Blue Ridge Home Solutions had been ordered to review its contracts and mailing records, not punished by lightning from heaven, though Nora Mitchell had privately mentioned she would not object to a small, well-aimed thunderbolt. Laura Bennett was still filing documents, still calling offices, still correcting people who used the word confusion when they meant pressure. Ruth Collins did not pretend everything was fine anymore, which in Cedar Glen counted as a miracle large enough to make the church bulletin. She still stood straight, still spoke sharply, still refused pity with the precision of a woman swatting flies from a picnic table. But now, when someone asked how she was, she sometimes answered, "Not fine yet." And the world did not collapse. Walter Collins moved more slowly than before, though perhaps he had simply stopped disguising it. His white hair lifted in the morning wind as he stood on the porch beside Caleb Hayes, watching two neighbors replace a sagging section of gutter. One neighbor was Owen Briggs, a retired mail carrier in his late 60s with a square jaw, dark brown skin, close-cropped gray hair, and knees that cracked so loudly every ladder step sounded like a weather report. The other was May Carter, 62, broad-shouldered, freckled, with thick blonde hair tucked under a baseball cap, and the cheerful authority of a woman who had raised 4 sons and feared neither rusty screws nor stubborn men. "Hold it higher," May called from the ladder. "Oh, and if that gutter slopes any lower, we'll be sending rainwater directly to South Carolina." Owen grunted. "My knees are voting against architecture." Ruth appeared in the doorway holding a tray of apple hand pies wrapped in cloth. "I told you both I was paying." "This is payment," May said, reaching down. "Your pies are better than money." Ruth narrowed her eyes. "That is the kind of sentence people use before asking for a second pie." "I was planning on asking for 3. Caleb, standing with his arms folded, glanced at Ruth. "Ma'am, with that level of negotiation, you could train recruits." Ruth handed him a pie with dangerous dignity. "Young man, if I trained recruits, wars would be shorter and kitchens would be cleaner." Walter laughed then, not loudly, but freely enough that Ruth turned to look at him. The laugh did not fix what had happened between them. Nothing so fragile should be forced to carry that much weight. But it crossed the porch like a small bird returning to a branch after a storm. The two German Shepherd puppies, now nearly 10 weeks old, tumbled through the wet leaves near the steps. The smaller one, whom Ruth had named June, because Michael had once said June was the kindest month, had grown into her ears just enough to look wise and surprised at the same time. Her black and tan fur was thickening, her paws still too large for her body, and she had a habit of sitting on Walter's shoes whenever voices became too tense. The bolder puppy, now called Scout, had a broader muzzle, brighter eyes, and the shameless confidence of a creature who believed every shoelace in America had been placed on earth for his personal improvement. Caleb had agreed to take Scout after 3 separate conversations with Denise Ward at the animal rescue, 2 sleepless nights, and 1 humiliating moment when Scout had fallen asleep on his boot, and Caleb had stood frozen for 20 minutes rather than wake him.
Caleb had not become whole. That was not how grief worked, no matter what sentimental people wrote on sympathy cards. Some nights he still woke reaching for a sound that was not there. Some mornings Ranger's old collar felt heavier in the drawer than metal had any right to be. But when Scout leaned against his leg, Caleb no longer stepped away. He looked down, breathed through the ache, and let the small living weight remain. Across town, Nora's shop had changed too. Mitchell's second-hand and sundries still sold chipped plates, lamps with questionable wiring, and at least one ceramic rooster nobody admitted to liking. But every Saturday morning, Nora cleared the front counter, brewed coffee strong enough to remove wallpaper, and hung a sign in the window that read, "Bring your papers, bring your pride, too. The coffee can handle both." Laura came when she could. Councilman Doyle helped connect residents with county offices. Henry Wilkes sorted envelopes by date, with the solemn pride of a former postman restored to usefulness. Lila Monroe told people when to sit down, drink water, or stop apologizing for being overwhelmed. Nora pretended this was all a temporary inconvenience, but she had bought 3 new folders, a larger coffee urn, and a jar labeled Button Fund after the day Scout scattered her sewing supplies across the floor. "I am not starting a movement," she told Ruth one Saturday. Ruth glanced at the room full of older neighbors reading letters together. "Of course not," Nora sniffed. "It is a gathering with stationery." "Naturally. And biscuits." "A revolution, then?" Nora tried not to smile and failed. At the Collins house, progress came in ordinary sounds. A hammer tapping porch boards, leaves dragged into piles, June barking at a rake, Walter asking Ruth before opening an official letter. That last part mattered most. Sometimes Ruth still snapped too quickly. Sometimes Walter still retreated into silence before remembering to come back. One evening, after Laura called with news that Blue Ridge had agreed to suspend several disputed accounts pending review, Ruth stood in the kitchen holding the phone long after the call ended. Walter asked, "Good news?" She said, "Not finished news." Then, after a pause, she added, "But not hopeless news." He nodded, and June placed one paw on his shoe as if signing the statement herself. On the final warm afternoon before the first hard frost, Walter carried the old iron cage into the backyard. Caleb helped him set it beside the porch steps, while Ruth watched with her arms crossed and suspicion in every line of her small body. "If you were planning to throw that away," she said, "I reserve the right to complain." Walter shook his head. He had already removed the cage door and laid it on the workbench. With a file borrowed from Tom Alvarez, he smoothed the sharp edges where the hinges had been. His hands trembled, but Caleb did not reach in to take over. Some repairs belonged to the person who had broken the thing open. Walter turned the cage upright, fastened it to 2 wooden stakes, and tucked young bean vines through the bars. The green tendrils curled uncertainly at first, then caught hold. Ruth stood very still. The cage looked different without the door. Not innocent, not new, but changed. Scout nosed the removed door, sneezed, and decided it was less interesting than Ruth's shoelace. June sat beside Walter and leaned into his leg. Ruth went into the kitchen and returned with the bent cardboard "For Sale" sign. Its chewed corner remained, the letters crooked and scarred. She did not throw it out. She tucked it on the shelf inside the back porch, behind a jar of clothespins where she would see it often enough to remember, but not so often that it ruled the room. Caleb left near sunset with Scout asleep on the passenger seat of his truck, one paw resting on Ranger's old collar, which Caleb had placed there without fully understanding why. Ruth and Walter stood on the porch. Nora waved from across the street, pretending she had not been watching the whole time. The house still had legal trouble ahead. Caleb still carried ghosts. Ruth and Walter were still learning the difficult grammar of honesty after decades of fluent silence. But in the backyard, the old cage without a door stood in the amber light, and the bean vines had begun to climb. Some things that once held fear, if opened carefully, could still give life, somewhere, to grow. Maybe the miracle in this story was not a sudden rescue, a perfect ending, or a problem disappearing overnight. Maybe God's mercy came in quieter ways. A puppy touching a cage door, a stranger choosing to stop, an old man finally telling the truth, and a proud woman learning that asking for help does not make her weak. So many people carry invisible cages made of shame, fear, and the words, "I'm fine." Ruth and Walter remind us that love cannot heal what silence keeps hidden. Caleb reminds us that even the strong can be afraid to care again. And Nora reminds us that sometimes the holiest thing a neighbor can do is open a door and make coffee. In daily life, we may not be asked to save a whole town, but we may be asked to notice one trembling hand, one tired face, one person trying to let go before they get hurt. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories of hope, mercy, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your home, and place kind people along your road when you need them most.